In the Torah it is written that a people who forget their covenant will slowly lose their protection and become vulnerable to forces greater than themselves. In the Bible it is written in the Book of Kings that when kings turn away from righteousness their kingdoms begin to crumble from within before enemies ever reach their gates. In the Quran it is said that nations are not destroyed suddenly but after repeated warnings that they choose to ignore. And this is where our story begins. Not with the fall, but with the warnings that came before it. Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment. If you are someone who seeks truth hidden inside history, if you believe that the past is not dead but is quietly repeating itself, then subscribe now, because what you are about to hear is not just history, it is a mirror. The kingdom of Judah, a land that once stood under divine protection, a people who once witnessed miracles, who once carried revelation, who once stood as a light among nations. But now, something had changed. The air itself felt heavy. The streets of Jerusalem were still filled with life. Markets were open. Priests were performing rituals. Kings still sat on thrones. But beneath the surface, a silent decay had already begun. This was not the Judah of Prophet Dawud, not the Judah of Prophet Suleiman. This was a kingdom that still had the name, but had begun to lose its soul. The people still prayed, but their hearts were elsewhere. The leaders still ruled, but their decisions were driven by fear. And the prophets, they were still warning, but fewer people were listening. This is always how collapse begins. Not with fire, not with invasion, but with a slow internal shift, where truth becomes uncomfortable, and falsehood becomes acceptable. At this time the world around Judah was changing rapidly. To the north and east, a new power was rising. The Neo Babylonian Empire, relentless, strategic, patient, they were not just conquerors. They were builders of dominance. And their king, Nebuchadnezzar, was not just a ruler. He was a force of history itself. While Judah was weakening internally, Babylon was strengthening externally, and this imbalance was about to change everything. But here is where the tragedy deepens. Judah was not unaware. They were warned. Again, and again, and again. Prophets walked their streets. Voices echoed in their courts. Messages came with clarity. Turn back. Correct yourselves. Do not trust in false alliances. Do not abandon what made you strong. But the people had grown comfortable. And comfort is one of the most dangerous states a nation can fall into. Because when people feel safe, they stop preparing. When leaders feel secure, they stop listening. And Judah was now walking blindly towards something it believed would never happen. Politically, the kingdom was making decisions that looked smart on the surface, but were hollow at their core. They began forming alliances, looking toward Egypt, trusting human strength, instead of divine guidance. This is a pattern repeated throughout history. When faith weakens, dependence shifts, from higher truth to temporary power. But Egypt was no longer the power it once was. And Babylon was not an enemy you could outplay with half measures. Yet the kings of Judah believed they could survive. They believed they could balance between powers. They believed they could maintain independence. This belief would cost them everything. Inside Jerusalem, life continued, but tension was rising. Some could feel it, a sense that something was not right, that something was coming, but most ignored it, because denial is easier than change. The prophets, however, they did not stop. One voice in particular stood firm against the tide. Jeremiah. He did not speak words people wanted to hear. He spoke truth, raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable. He warned that Babylon was not just a political threat, it was a consequence of years of spiritual decline, of ignoring divine commands, of turning faith into ritual without meaning. But instead of listening, the people turned against him. They mocked him, rejected him, even punished him, because truth, when it threatens comfort, is often treated as the enemy. And so Judah stood at a crossroads. One path, repentance, correction, return. The other, denial, pride, destruction. History shows us which path they chose. But before the fall, before the siege, before the destruction of Jerusalem, there was still time that was wasted, because while Judah was busy negotiating alliances, Babylon was preparing war. While Judah was silencing prophets, Babylon was strengthening its armies. While Judah was convincing itself that everything would be fine, Babylon was moving closer. This is the illusion that destroys nations. The belief that collapse cannot happen to us. But history does not recognize arrogance. It only follows consequences. And now, the storm was almost at the gates. The moment had arrived, not suddenly, not unexpectedly, but exactly as it had been warned. The horizon around Jerusalem began to change. Dust clouds rose in the distance, not from wind, but from movement, from an army that did not rush, because it did not need to. Babylon had come. This was not a raid, not a temporary invasion. This was something far more calculated. A slow tightening grip, a siege. King Nebuchadnezzar did not intend to destroy Judah overnight. He intended to break it, piece by piece, hope by hope, until surrender felt easier than resistance. And so the city of Jerusalem, once filled with confidence, now stood surrounded, cut off, isolated. Inside the walls, fear began to spread, but still, even now, there were those who refused to accept reality. The leaders still believed in alliances, still hoped that Egypt would come, still convinced themselves that help was near. But help was not coming. This is the danger of false hope. It delays action, until action becomes impossible. The siege tightened. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Food began to run out. Water became scarce. And the people, who once ignored the warnings, now began to feel them. Hunger does something to a society. It strips away illusions. It exposes truth. Families that once lived in comfort, now struggled to survive. Markets that once thrived, now stood empty. The sounds of celebration were replaced by whispers of fear. And still, the question remained, why had it come to this? The answer was not outside the walls. It was inside them. Years of ignoring truth, years of corrupt leadership, years of spiritual emptiness, had finally taken their toll. The strength of a nation is not measured when it is at peace. It is revealed when it is under pressure. And Judah was now being tested. Jeremiah, the prophet they had rejected, was still there, still warning, still speaking, even as everything around him collapsed. He told them clearly, do not resist Babylon, surrender, because this is not just a war, it is a consequence. But his words sounded like betrayal to a people blinded by pride, and so instead of listening, they imprisoned him. This is one of the darkest patterns in human history. When truth becomes inconvenient, those who speak it are silenced. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Babylon waited, disciplined, patient, unshaken. They knew time was on their side, because a city under siege will eventually collapse from within. And inside Jerusalem, that collapse had already begun. Morale was breaking, trust was disappearing, desperation was rising. People began to question their leaders. But it was too late. Because leadership is not tested when decisions are easy. It is tested when consequences arrive. King Zedekiah faced a reality he could no longer ignore. He had trusted the wrong alliances, ignored the right warnings, and now, he was trapped. The walls that once protected him had become a prison. Still, there were moments, small chances, where things could have changed. But pride is a powerful force. Even when survival demanded humility, many still chose denial. And so the siege continued, relentless, unforgiving. Children cried from hunger, parents searched for answers, and the city, once a symbol of faith, became a place of suffering. Outside, Babylon prepared for the final phase. Because sieges are not endless, they have an end, and that end is always devastating. Inside the palace, fear consumed the king, but even then, instead of making a decisive move, he hesitated. Hesitation, at the edge of collapse, is fatal. And then, the moment came. The walls, that once stood strong, were breached. Babylon entered Jerusalem, not as guests, but as conquerors. Chaos erupted, the streets filled with panic. People ran, but there was nowhere to go. Because when a city falls, it falls completely. The soldiers of Babylon moved with precision, taking control, securing dominance, and the kingdom of Judah, the last remnant of a once great legacy, began to crumble. King Zedekiah tried to escape under the cover of night, but he was captured, and what happened next was not just defeat, it was humiliation. His sons were killed before his eyes, and then his eyes were taken from him. The last thing he ever saw was the end of his own legacy. This is how power ends, when it is built on illusion. Jerusalem was no longer a city of strength, it was a conquered land. The temple, the sacred center, was destroyed, burned, reduced to ruins, a symbol, not just of physical destruction, but of a deeper loss. The people were taken into exile, forced to leave everything behind. Homes, memories, identity, all gone. And just like that, the kingdom of Judah came to an end. But here is the truth that goes beyond the tragedy. This was not just about Babylon. This was not just about war. This was about a pattern where warnings are ignored, where truth is rejected, where comfort replaces awareness, and when the consequences finally arrive, they feel sudden, even though they were always coming. The city had fallen, the walls were broken, the temple was gone, the people were scattered. Silence replaced everything, not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after devastation. Jerusalem, once a symbol of faith, now stood as a warning. But this is where most people misunderstand history. They see the destruction, but they fail to understand the message. Because the fall of Judah was not just an ending, it was a revelation about how nations rise and how they fall. Because what happened to Judah has happened before, and has happened after, and is happening even now. The pattern is always the same. It begins with strength, a people united by purpose, guided by truth, grounded in something greater than themselves. Then slowly, that connection weakens, truth becomes secondary, values become flexible, and faith becomes ritual. At this stage, nothing looks broken. From the outside, everything still appears normal, but internally, the foundation is cracking. Then comes the next phase. Warnings. Voices begin to rise, calling for correction, calling for awareness, calling for a return. But these voices are rarely welcomed, because they challenge comfort, they disturb the illusion, and so they are ignored, or mocked, or silenced. And once that happens, the final stage begins. Consequences, not random, not sudden, but inevitable. Judah reached that stage, And when Babylon came, it was not just an enemy. It was the consequence of everything that had been ignored. Now think about this. Judah believed it was protected because of its past, because of its identity, because of its history. But history does not protect you if you abandon what created it. This is one of the most dangerous beliefs. Any nation, any society, any individual can have the belief that what happened to others cannot happen to us. But history proves, again and again, that no one is immune. After the fall, the people of Judah were taken into exile, a foreign land, a foreign rule, a new reality. Everything they once knew was gone, and in that exile, something changed. For the first time, they were forced to reflect, not on their strength, but on their mistakes. And this is where the real lesson begins. Because sometimes, it is only after losing everything that people begin to understand what they had. The prophets, who were once ignored, were now remembered. Their warnings now made sense. But by then, it was too late. This is the tragedy of delayed realization. Understanding after consequence. But even in this, there was a deeper message. Because destruction was not the end, it was a reset, a painful one, but a necessary one. Because without consequences, there is no accountability, and without accountability, there is no change. So the fall of Judah became more than a story. It became a sign for every generation. That strength is not permanent. That protection is not guaranteed. That identity alone is not enough. What matters is what you do with what you have been given. And this is where the story connects to today. Look around. How many societies are repeating the same pattern? Comfort replacing awareness, power replacing responsibility, noise replacing truth, and warnings being ignored. The forms may be different, but the pattern is identical. And that is why this story matters. Because it is not about the past, it is about the present and the future. The question is not, what happened to Judah? The question is, are we paying attention, or are we walking the same path? Because the most dangerous moment is not when the enemy arrives. It is when the warnings begin, and no one listens. So take this story, not as history, but as a mirror that shows what happens when truth is ignored, when pride leads, when correction is rejected. Because the fall does not begin at the gates, it begins inside, and once it reaches the gates, it is already too late. Before you leave, if this story made you think, if it made you question, if it made you see the world differently, then subscribe. Because this is just one story from a pattern that spans all of human history. And in the next episode, we will uncover another moment where warnings were given, choices were made, and consequences changed everything. Until then, remember, history does not repeat because it wants to. It repeats because people refuse to learn.